September 1st, 1943, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai paused over an intelligence report. His one good eye scanning lines that made him laugh in the hot, damp tent. The Americans had built a new fighter, the report said. It was heavy like a bomber, wide like a transport. They called it the Hellcat, and it supposedly weighed twice as much as the Zero. To Sakai, that meant it would be slow, clumsy, and easy prey. Outside, rows of A6M Zero fighters waited on the pierced steel runway, slim and quick. The same kind of planes that had ruled the skies for 2 years. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, Dutch Buffaloes, none had lasted long against Zero pilots. This new bloated Hellcat would surely fail to, he thought, but unknown to Sakai and the rest of the Japanese naval aviators assembling for the morning briefing. The next month would begin a relentless collapse of Japan's air power. The F6F Hellcat would earn a kill ratio near 19-1. Downing more than 5,000 enemy aircraft while losing only a few hundred in air-to-air combat. It would reshape how carriers fought, cripple Japan's air arm, and prove that the Zero's dominance had rested on risky assumptions. An airplane that looked wrong and felt heavy would soon overturn the muff of air combat. Within 6 months, many of the pilots laughing at the report would be writing last letters home. Knowing that meeting Hellcats often meant near certain death, Japan's confidence in September 1943 came from numbers, not just pride. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had won with stunning ratios. At Pearl Harbor, only 29 aircraft were lost while 347 were destroyed on the American side. In the Philippines, the losses were 7 against 103 shot down. Over Darwin, Australia, to 430. The British Far East Fleet's air wing was smashed. The Dutch East Indies Air Force collapsed in days. At the center of this success was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a fighter that seemed to break the rules. When captured Zeros were tested in 1942, American engineers first doubted the data. How could a fighter fly as far as a bomber, turn like an old biplane, and still carry guns powerful enough to shred anything it caught? Japan's top ace, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, described the Zero as if it were part of the pilot so responsive it felt like wearing wings. By comparison, American planes seemed like strong but clumsy trucks. The Zero achieved its speed and agility by cutting weight everywhere. A secret aluminum alloy made the airframe much lighter. Armor for the pilot was removed. Self-sealing fuel tanks were omitted. Radios were sometimes left out to save a little more. Every ounce went to performance, not protection. Early 1943 reports of the new F6F reached Japanese intelligence through neutral Sweden. But the figures sounded like lies or tricks. A fully loaded weight over 12,000 pounds versus the Zero's 5,800. A big wing area, a bulky radial engine, thousands of rounds of ammo, armor plates, thick glass, and self-sealing tanks holding a large fuel load. Captain Minoru Genda, a key planner of Pearl Harbor, reviewed the specs and dismissed them. The Americans, he said, were still trying to replace skill with machinery. A Zero would dance around it and win. The math seemed to agree. The Zero's lower wing loading meant it could turn tighter, while the Hellcat's higher wing loading suggested a larger turning circle. If the fight was about turning, the Hellcat would be helpless. But the first face-to-face encounter changed everything. On September 30th, 1943, over Marcus Island, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui spotted 6 dark blue planes climbing. At first he thought they were twin-engine bombers. Then he recognized the silhouette. One engine, thick body, wings that seemed stubby. He turned to get behind one, using the standard Zero tactic of cutting inside an opponent's turn. But the Hellcat did not play the turning game. It went straight up, using raw power to climb at a rate the Zero couldn't match. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat hung on its propeller, swung its nose down in a sharp, controlled pivot, and came straight onto Fukui's tail. 6 guns opened up, spitting a storm of bullets. Fukui's aircraft was hit many times in seconds. Only by spinning away did he survive, barely limping back, full of holes. His wingmen and the recon plane did not return. The first blood went to the Hellcat. Days later, on October 5, 1943, the Americans struck Wake Island. Japanese pilots climbed above a formation of Hellcats, certain they held the advantage height. Position, surprise. The American fighters held together and made shallow dives to keep their speed. When the Zeros fired at long range, the Hellcats soaked up the hits. Armor around the pilot, protected oil systems, self-sealing tanks, they all did their job. Once the Zeros had spent ammunition during diving pauses, the Hellcats counterattacked, not by turning but by using energy. They climbed back up with full power to altitudes where the Zero's engines starved for air. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still had strong power. The Zeros did not. Then the Hellcats dropped like hawks, fired, and zoomed back up before the Zeros could react. 8 Zeros fell. No Hellcats were lost. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanemizu began telling others, "Forget what you know." The Americans had stopped fighting the Zeros kind of fight. They used speed and altitude like a bank account, converting height into speed for fast attacks, then cashing back into altitude for safety. They flew in pairs and divisions, with constant radio talk to coordinate. Japanese pilots flew like lone warriors. The Americans fought as a connected machine dot by late 1943. The technology gap was also obvious. A Hellcat 6.50 caliber machine guns through a dense stream of heavy rounds, with far more energy per second than the Zero's lighter guns. Worse for the Japanese, shipboard radar vectored Hellcats directly to intercept, long before Japanese pilots ever saw them. Interceptions arrived from above, from the sun, on the perfect bearing. 2 Japanese pilots. It was like being ambushed by an enemy that could see through clouds and darkness. At the same time, Japan's pilot training pipeline was breaking. Before the war, Navy pilots took years to train and had hundreds of flight hours. By early 1944, shortages of fuel and time meant pilots reached combat with half or less of that experience. Many had little gunnery practice, minimal formation flying, and weak instrument or radio discipline. By contrast, American pilots arrived with steady training plenty of live-fire time, and repeated practice of the same energy tactics the Hellcat used in combat. As one Japanese training officer wrote bluntly, children were being sent to fight professionals. In October 1944, during the raids around Formosa, the gap opened into a gulf. The Japanese threw more than 700 aircraft into the fight, including many of their last well-trained pilots. Reports claimed massive American losses, but the truth was reversed. Japanese losses were huge, and many scarce veterans died. Survivors described Hellcats covering the sky in layers at every height band, turning the air into a deadly grid. The pattern continued at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese strike waves were detected far out by radar, and Hellcats were guided into perfect positions. The Americans attacked from above and behind with the sun at their back, then zoom climbed away. Japanese formations unraveled under the repeated, disciplined high-speed posses. Hundreds of aircraft were shot down that day for small American losses. In October 1940, at Leyte Gulf, Commander David McCampbell set a record with 9 kills in a single mission, while his wingmen shot down 6. 7 Hellcats faced around 60 attackers and tore them apart without losing a plane. By then, air superiority had flipped completely. The psychological strain on Japanese pilots grew unbearable. Reports spoke of Hellcat psychosis, the sense that the enemy was not just a pilot in a plane, but part of a large, precise machine that always knew where you were and how to kill you. Training hours kept dropping as fuel and time ran out. By early 1945, many Navy pilots had only a few dozen hours of flight time. Some sent to die in suicide missions had barely a week of training. In the Okinawa campaign, Japan launched nearly 2,000 suicide sorties. The Hellcat became both sword and shield, intercepting attackers and forming a protective canopy over the fleet. American pilots refined team tactics, such as sweeping in line abreast, each covering a slice of the sky to cut down incoming aircraft. The numbers from Okinawa showed how effective the system had become. Tens of thousands of sorties flown by Hellcats, thousands of enemy aircraft shot down, and most suicide planes stopped before ever reaching ships. By 1945, the technology gap was wider still. Newer Hellcats had more power, rocket racks, better armor, and improved gun sights that calculated lead automatically, making deflection shooting far easier. Even master Japanese aces struggled to survive. Saburo Sakai later wrote how he used every trick of aerobatics, but the Hellcat kept up with ease. He lived only because the American pilot forgot to drop an external fuel tank. The raw counting at war's end was brutal. Hellcats racked up. The majority of Navy air-to-air victories created hundreds of American aces and posted a kill ratio that defied belief. Japan, meanwhile, had lost almost all of its experienced naval aviators. What once had been an elite force became a desperate one, turning to suicide attacks because conventional tactics no longer worked. One Japanese admiral justified the suicide approach with cold logic. In a normal attack on a carrier, a Zero had almost no chance to get through the Hellcat barrier. turn the plane into a human-guided bomb, and the chance rises. Even if the pilot certainly dies either way. As the war closed, final encounters carried symbolic weight. On the day of Japan's surrender broadcast, a Hellcat scored the last aerial victory of the conflict, ending the Pacific Air War with the same aircraft that had come to dominate it. During the occupation, Japanese pilots watched American Hellcat demonstrations with shock. The stunts and climbs would have torn a Zero apart, they realized, and the American pilot explained that he was not even pushing the plane to its limits. After the war, Japanese engineers examined Hellcats and saw the depth of American industrial strength. Engines built from thousands of precisely machined, interchangeable parts. A manufacturing process capable of producing enormous numbers of aircraft quickly without losing quality. Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, concluded that Japan had built a perfect 1941 fighter, while America had built a complete 1945 air combat system. American factories rolled out more than 12,000 Hellcats in 2.5 years, sometimes one per hour, a pace Japan simply could not match. The Hellcat did more than win dogfights, it changed strategy. Before the war, carriers were thought of as fragile and dependent on striking first. With Hellcats overhead, carriers became floating fortresses. American admirals could keep fleets on station near enemy shores for weeks because the air defense net was so strong. Beneath the engineering was a clash of cultures. Japanese doctrine prized individual skill, spirit, and acceptance of death. The American way focused on teamwork, equipment, communication, and preserving pilots for the next mission. Even when Japanese pilots learned what the Hellcat was doing tactically, their training and culture made it hard to adopt the same avoid and strike methods. Refusing a bad fight was a core American idea, and a difficult one within traditional Japanese thinking. Years later, veterans from both sides agreed on the big picture. America's top Navy ace called the Hellcat the decisive factor in the Pacific Air War. Saburo Sakai answered that the Zero was a superb fighter, but the Hellcat was part of a larger weapons system, and Japan had not understood that difference until too late. The final judgment came down to simple math and the power behind it. A staggering kill ratio, thousands of planes produced, thousands of pilots trained, and a complete air defense and control network that turned fighters into parts of a coordinated machine. Admiral Ozawa said they laughed at the Hellcat because they thought it was just another plane, when in fact it represented an entire way of waging war. By the time they realized this, Japan's air forces were gone. Sakai lived long after the war and later said that the Zero made Japan believe it was great, while the Hellcat forced Japan to see limits it could not overcome. Every extra pound the Hellcat carried armor, fuel, radios, ammo was not weakness, but proof of an industrial democracy that could protect its pilots and fight as a system. When that system reached full strength, the laughter stopped. The Hellcat did not just defeat planes or pilots, it crushed a belief about how to win in the air. In modern war, the side that builds the better system beats the side that only builds better warriors. The Japanese had laughed at the F6F Hellcat. In the end, the Hellcat laughed last.